Staff Sergeant Mike Daniels had been working on A-10s for 6 years by February 1991, and he thought he'd seen everything sheet metal could do. He was wrong. The Warthog sitting on the ramp at King Fahd International Airport had a hole in the right engine nacelle wide enough to put his head through. A 57mm anti-aircraft round had punched clean through the titanium bathtub. The armored cockpit shell that Republic Aviation's engineers had built to absorb exactly this kind of punishment, and exited out the other side, shredding hydraulic lines and severing half the flight control cables on its way through. Fuel had been streaming from a ruptured wing tank for the entire flight home, leaving a trail of JP-8 across 140 miles of Saudi desert that Daniels could actually smell before the aircraft taxied into view. The right engine was producing roughly 40% of rated thrust. The left wasn't doing much better. And on the nose, beneath the cockpit rail where the pilot's name was stenciled in block letters, someone had already painted 2 small silhouettes of Soviet-made Ma-24 Hind helicopters. Daniels walked the airframe for 20 minutes. He counted 11 separate holes from anti-aircraft fire, not including the big one. The landing gear had come down on manual backup. The pilot, Captain Todd Sheehy, 23rd Tactical Fighter Wing, had flown the thing home on partial hydraulics, 1 functioning engine, and what Daniels would later describe to a maintenance debrief as pure stubbornness and a plane that refused to quit. The maintenance report from that inspection still exists in Air Force records, and the language is remarkably dry for what it describes: structural damage to fuselage stations 341 through 388, loss of primary hydraulic system, secondary hydraulic system operating at reduced pressure, right engine turbine section FOD damage consistent with fragmentation ingestion. Then, almost as an afterthought at the bottom of the form, aircraft is repairable. Read that again. The form didn't say salvageable, didn't say may be returned to service pending depot-level inspection. It said repairable, as in Daniels and his crew could fix it right there on the ramp with the tools they had, and someone could fly it back into combat within 72 hours. Which is exactly what happened. But the kill marks are the part of this story that matters. 2 Iraqi Hinds, the gunship NATO had spent 15 years worrying about. The one Western defense planners had built entire doctrine around countering. Shot down by a plane that looked like someone had assembled it from spare parts in a garage. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was not fast, and it was not sleek. It carried no sophisticated beyond visual range missiles when it went helicopter hunting. She killed those Hinds the same way every A-10 pilot killed things in Desert Storm. He pointed the nose at them and pulled the trigger on the GAU-8/A Avenger, a 30mm rotary cannon that weighed 4,029 pounds, fully loaded, and fired depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 3,900 per minute. The gun was so large that the engineers at Fairchild Republic had essentially built the airplane around it. The nose landing gear is offset to the left of the aircraft centerline because the gun barrel sits on the centerline. Think about that for a second. They moved the landing gear for the gun, not the other way around. The Soviets had opinions about this airplane, GRU assessments from the early 1980s, several of which were captured or leaked after the Soviet collapse, consistently referred to the A-10 as a throwback, a slow-moving anachronism in an age of supersonic strike aircraft. One assessment from 1982, translated and published by the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1993, called it an aircraft of limited combat value against a modern integrated air defense system. Soviet pilots training at Lipetsk reportedly called it Gryazhnaya Svinya, dirty pig. The implication was clear enough. In a real war against Soviet air defenses, the A-10 would be target practice. SA-6 batteries and ZSU-23-4 Shilka mobile guns would eat it alive. The plane was too slow to survive and too simple to respect. The Soviets got it wrong, and the proof was sitting on that ramp in Saudi Arabia. They evaluated the A-10 against the wrong criteria. They measured it by speed, by technological sophistication, by the standards that mattered for air superiority fighters and supersonic bombers. The A-10 wasn't built to be fast. It was built to be present, to loiter over a battlefield for hours, to fly low enough to distinguish a T-72 from a friendly M1 Abrams, to take hits that would have killed any other tactical aircraft in the American inventory, and to deliver that massive cannon directly onto targets with a precision that no high-altitude bomber could match. The Soviets saw an airplane that couldn't run away from their missiles. They missed the fact that it didn't need to. Shi flew 43 combat missions during Desert Storm. The aircraft he brought back that day was repaired and flew again within 3 days. And the story of how a plane the Soviets dismissed as a flying joke ended up destroying their most feared attack helicopter. With a gun, at close range, in a war that was supposed to prove the age of the tank-killing airplane was over, starts not in the desert, but in a Pentagon office in 1966, with a war that was already going badly. The Pentagon in 1966 smelled like cigarette smoke and bad coffee, and the offices on the E-ring, the outermost corridor, where the windows actually looked out onto something other than more Pentagon, belonged to men who had spent the better part of a decade trying to fight a war with the wrong tools. The problem wasn't classified. Everyone in the building knew it. American pilots were dying over Vietnam in close air support missions at rates that made Korean War veterans wince, and the aircraft they were flying had almost nothing to do with the mission they were being asked to perform. The F-100 Super Sabre, the F-105 Thunderchief, the F-4 Phantom. These were expensive, fuel-hungry, absurdly fast machines designed to deliver nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory or to fight other jets at Mach 2. Now, they were being sent down into the weeds at 500 knots to find individual trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to strafe tree lines where a company of Marines was pinned down, to loiter over a landing zone and wait for someone on the ground to pop smoke. They couldn't do it. The F-105 in particular was a disaster in the close air support role. It burned fuel so fast at low altitude that pilots had maybe 10 minutes over a target before they had to head home. And it was so fast that by the time a pilot identified what he was shooting at, he'd already flown past it. The Air Force was losing an F-105 every 4 days by mid-1966. At roughly $2.1 million per airframe, the math alone was unsustainable, never mind the pilots. The deeper problem was institutional. The Air Force didn't want to do close air support. It never had. Since its separation from the Army in 1947, the Air Force had defined itself around strategic bombing and air superiority. The glamorous missions, the ones that justified big budgets and fast jets and general officer billets. Close air support was grunt work. It meant flying low and slow, getting shot at by small arms, and answering to some Army lieutenant colonel on the ground who wanted you to put ordnance on a tree line 200 meters from his own troops. The Army, predictably, was furious. Army generals had been arguing since Korea that if the Air Force wouldn't provide adequate close air support, the Army should be allowed to operate its own fixed-wing attack aircraft. The Key West Agreement of 1948, the inter-service pact that divided roles and missions among the newly independent branches, technically prohibited this, restricting the Army to helicopters and light observation planes. But by 1966, the Army was pushing hard against those boundaries, developing the AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter specifically because it couldn't get fixed-wing close air support it trusted from the Air Force. The designation AH stood for attack helicopter, which was itself a bureaucratic invention. The Army couldn't call it a fighter or an attack plane without violating Key West, so attack helicopter became the legally permissible term for what was essentially a flying gun platform. Anyway, the point is that the Air Force found itself in a position where it either built a proper close air support airplane or lost the mission entirely to Army aviation. Into this institutional knife fight walked Pierre Sprey, and the Air Force has never quite forgiven him for it. Sprey was a weapons systems analyst at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Not a pilot, not an engineer by training, but a statistician with a background in operations research who had spent years studying what actually killed things on a battlefield versus what the services claimed killed things on a battlefield. His conclusions were inflammatory. The complex multi-purpose aircraft is a myth. He wrote in a 1965 internal memo that circulated widely enough to make him permanently unwelcome at several Air Force commands. Sprey argued that every attempt to build a do-everything airplane produced a machine that did nothing well, and that close air support specifically demanded an aircraft that was slow, simple, heavily armored, carried an enormous gun, could operate from damaged runways, and cost little enough that the Air Force could afford to lose some without congressional hearings. He wanted an airplane that looked backward, propeller-driven even in early concept sketches, at a time when every program office in the Pentagon was chasing Mach 2 and beyond. The generals hated him. They called his concept the Pierre Sprey Special and meant it as an insult. But Sprey had the ear of a handful of civilian reformers in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, men like John Boyd and Everest Ricconi, who were already waging their own guerrilla campaign against what they saw as the Air Force's obsession with gold-plated technology at the expense of combat effectiveness. These were not fringe cranks. Boyd had rewritten the textbook on energy maneuverability theory. Riccioni was a decorated fighter pilot with a Ph.D. Between them, they had enough credibility and hard data to be dangerous, and what the data said was that the Air Force was getting pilots killed for no reason other than institutional vanity. By 1967, something broke loose. The Air Force issued a request for information for what it designated the AX program, Attack Experimental. The specification read like Pierre Sprey's wish list written in official language, a dedicated close air support aircraft, optimized for low-altitude operations, with long loiter time, heavy armor, massive ordnance capacity, and a built-in cannon as the primary weapon system. What kind of gun do you build when the entire point of the airplane is the gun? General Electric's answer weighed 620 pounds empty. The GAU-8/A Avenger was a 7-barrel rotary cannon chambered in 30 by 173 millimeters, a round so large that a single complete cartridge was about the length of a man's forearm. The weapon system, including its ammunition drum, feed mechanism, hydraulic drive motor, and linkage chutes, tipped the scales at 4,029 pounds combat loaded. That's 2 tons of gun in an airplane with a maximum takeoff weight of around 50,000 pounds. Look at the numbers. The gun assembly alone represented roughly 8% of the aircraft's total loaded weight. By comparison, the M61 Vulcan cannon carried by the F-16, itself no small weapon, weighed 248 pounds and fired a 20-millimeter round with about 1/5 the kinetic energy per projectile. The Avenger wasn't even in the same conversation. The ammunition was the part that kept Soviet armor designers awake. GE developed 2 primary rounds for the GAU-8/A, a high-explosive incendiary for soft targets, and the PGU-14/B armor-piercing incendiary, which used a dense penetrator core of depleted uranium alloyed with a small percentage of titanium. Depleted uranium is roughly 1.7 times denser than lead. When it strikes hardened steel at high velocity, it doesn't mushroom the way conventional penetrators do. It self-sharpens, fracturing in a way that maintains a pointed cross-section as it bores through armor plate, and then it burns. The pyrophoric nature of uranium means that fragments ignite spontaneously on the far side of the armor, spraying molten metal into the crew compartment and ammunition storage of whatever vehicle was unlucky enough to be in the way. At a firing rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, 65 rounds per second, the Avenger could put a concentration of these projectiles onto a target area roughly the size of a 40-foot circle from a slant range of 4,000 feet. A typical firing pass lasted between 1 and 2 seconds. That's 65 to 130 rounds of depleted uranium arriving on a single vehicle in less time than it takes to flinch. The Soviet T-62, which was the backbone of Warsaw Pact armored forces through the 1970s and early 1980s, had a maximum of 242 millimeters of cast steel armor on its turret front. The PGU-14/B could penetrate 76 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent at a 30-degree angle of impact from 4,000 feet. That doesn't sound like enough to defeat 242 millimeters of frontal armor, and it wasn't, from the front. But the A-10 wasn't designed to attack tanks head-on. The doctrine called for passes from the side and rear, where even the T-72, the more modern Soviet tank that was supposed to replace the T-62, offered between 40 and 80 millimeters of effective armor protection. The math was brutal. One pass, one dead tank. Soviet analysts understood this perfectly well. A 1984 technical assessment from the Kubinka Armor Research Institute, portions of which were declassified by Russian authorities in 1997, evaluated the GAU-8/A's terminal effects against T-62 and T-72 side armor and concluded that the probability of crew incapacitation or catastrophic ammunition detonation approaches unity at engagement ranges below 1,200 meters with a burst duration exceeding 1 second. Approaches unity. In mathematical language, that means certainty. The Soviets ran the tests, did the calculations, and arrived at an answer they didn't like. If an A-10 got a clean pass on a Soviet tank from the side, that tank was finished. This created an interesting disconnect in Soviet military thinking. Publicly, in the assessments that filtered through GRU channels to frontline commanders, the A-10 was a joke, slow, ugly, unsurvivable against modern air defenses. But at Kubinka, where people actually shot DU rounds at T-72 hull sections and measured what happened on the other side, the tone was different. The Research Institute's recommendation wasn't to dismiss the A-10. It was to accelerate development of explosive reactive armor packages, specifically designed to defeat the 30mm DU rounds penetration characteristics. The Contact 1 ERA system that began appearing on Soviet tanks in 1985 was designed primarily to counter shaped charge warheads from anti-tank guided missiles, but secondary testing against kinetic penetrators like the PGU-14/B was part of the evaluation matrix. Real money and real engineering hours directed at a threat they publicly called irrelevant. Fairchild Republic's engineers, meanwhile, had built the airplane around this weapon with a literalness that most aerospace engineers would call insane. The gun's barrel cluster sat precisely on the aircraft centerline. The nose gear was moved to a pod offset to the right. The firing port was positioned so that the active barrel, barrel number 9 in the rotational sequence, aligned with the center of gravity, preventing the massive recoil force of roughly 10,000 pounds from yawing the aircraft off target during a burst. 5:37 a.m. local time, January 26, 1991. The sun wasn't fully up yet over western Iraq, and the light had that flat gray quality that makes everything on the desert floor look like the same shade of nothing. Captain Robert Swain, 706th Tactical Fighter Squadron, was flying a combat search and rescue support mission roughly 60 miles northwest of the Saudi border when his wingman called out movement below them. Two shapes, low, fast, hugging the terrain. Iraqi helicopters, Bo-1 O-5s, the German-built light utility type that Iraq had purchased in quantity during the 1980s, running south towards a cluster of Iraqi ground positions. Swain had never trained for this. No A-10 pilot had. The Warthog's entire doctrinal existence revolved around killing things on the ground. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces, trucks, bunkers. The training syllabus at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base covered low-altitude weapons delivery, combat search and rescue support, forward air controller procedures, and anti-armor tactics. Nowhere in the curriculum was there a block of instruction titled, How to Shoot Down a Helicopter with a 30mm cannon. The GAU-8/A's firing solution assumed a stationary or slow-moving ground target. Its ballistic computer calculated lead angle and bullet drop for something sitting still on a desert floor, not for an aircraft moving laterally at 120 knots. Swain rolled in anyway. The Bo 105 was below him and to the left, moving fast but not fast enough. Maybe 100 knots heading south, apparently unaware of the A-10 bearing down from above and behind. The geometry was ugly. A helicopter in flight is a smaller target than a T-72 from above, and it's moving in 3 dimensions instead of 2. The Avenger's dispersion pattern, that 40-foot circle at 4,000 feet of slant range, suddenly seemed a lot less generous when the target was an airframe roughly 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, translating across the sky. He squeezed the trigger for less than 2 seconds. The sound inside the cockpit was what every A-10 pilot who's ever fired the gun describes. A deep, shuddering brrrr that vibrated through the airframe so hard it blurred the instrument panel. The smell of gun gas, burned propellant and ozone, acrid enough to taste even through an oxygen mask, filled the cockpit immediately. 65 rounds per second left the muzzle at 3,500 feet per second. And at the range Swain was firing from, the time of flight was negligible. The Bo 105 came apart. Pieces of rotor blade and fuselage tumbled away from a central fireball that Swain's wingman later described as surprisingly small. Not some dramatic fireball, but a sharp orange flash, followed by a dense column of black smoke that marked the crash site on the desert floor like a signal flare. That was the first helicopter kill by a fixed-wing jet using its gun in the history of the Gulf War. The records are slightly muddled on whether it was the first fixed-wing gun kill of a helicopter in any modern conflict. Sources conflict, and the Iran-Iraq War produced claims that are difficult to verify. What's not ambiguous is what Swain had demonstrated. The same weapon built to kill the most heavily armored vehicles on Earth. Worked against aircraft too, as long as those aircraft were slow enough and low enough to fall within the Avenger's engagement envelope. The A-10's designers had never explicitly intended that. Within 48 hours, word had spread through every A-10 squadron in theater. Pilots started actively hunting Iraqi helicopters. The math wasn't complicated. If the GAU-8/A could kill a tank with a 2-second burst, a helicopter was just a thinner-skinned target with a bigger radar cross-section. The Iraqi Air Force had dispersed significant numbers of helicopters to highway strips and improvised landing pads across southern Iraq, and many of these were attempting to reposition or evacuate as coalition ground forces advanced. A-10 pilots found them in the air, on the ground, half hidden under camouflage netting that did nothing against a pilot flying low enough to see the rotor disc. By the end of the war, A-10s had been credited with destroying 2 confirmed helicopters air-to-air and an estimated 23 on the ground. Todd Sheehy's 2 hind kills came on separate missions in February, both with the gun, both from slant ranges under 4,000 feet. Lieutenant Colonel Greg Boomer Wilson pushed his throttles forward into a shallow dive over the Mutla Ridge Road at 11:42 a.m. on February 26th and saw something below him that didn't have a name yet. It would get one later, the Highway of Death, but in that moment, it was just a road full of vehicles stretching north from Kuwait City toward Basra. Bumper to bumper, 4 lanes wide in places where drivers had pulled onto the shoulders and median, and absolutely none of them were moving. Coalition aircraft had hit the lead vehicles and the tail vehicles simultaneously, boxing in everything between them. And now the column sat there cooking in the late morning sun, while flight after flight checked in on the tactical frequency requesting clearance to engage. Wilson's flight of 4 A-10s had been diverted from a pre-planned interdiction mission near Wadi al-Batin. They arrived with full combat loads, each aircraft carrying 6 Mk-82 500-pound general-purpose bombs, 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, and 1,174 rounds of 30mm ammunition. The forward air controller on station, call sign Nail 56, was working so many flights simultaneously that Wilson's four-ship had to hold in an orbit for 9 minutes before getting cleared in. 9 minutes circling at 8,000 feet, staring down at what looked like a junkyard that went on for miles. The fuel smell inside the cockpit mixed with something else drifting up from below, burning rubber and petroleum, thick enough to leave a haze at altitude. When Nail 56 finally cleared them hot, Wilson split his flight into 2 elements, and they went to work. The first pass was bombs. Each aircraft rolled in from 8,000 feet at a 30-degree dive angle, pickled 2 Mk-82s per pass, pulled off hard left to avoid the fragmentation envelope, and came back around for another run. The bombs hit clusters of vehicles, not individual targets, but groups of 5 or 6 packed so tightly together that a single 500-pound bomb's blast radius overlapped multiple airframes. Trucks, buses, stolen Kuwaiti civilian cars loaded with looted goods, T-55 tanks, BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles, fire trucks that the Iraqis had apparently commandeered for transport. The column contained military and quasi-military vehicles in a ratio that nobody on the American side bothered to calculate at the time. After-action reports from the 23rd Tactical Fighter Wing list the vehicle types destroyed by Wilson's flight alone as including 4 T-55s, 7 BMP-1s, 11 military trucks, and an unspecified number of civilian vehicles assessed as being used for military purposes. The report uses the phrase target-rich environment 4 times in 2 pages. The phrase does a lot of work to avoid describing what was actually happening on that road. After the bombs were gone, Wilson's flight switched to Mavericks. The AGM-65D infrared variant was designed for single-vehicle kills. Lock the seeker head onto a heat source, fire, forget. Each missile cost roughly $111,000 in 1991 dollars. Wilson expended both of his on what he identified as T-55s in defilade positions at the northern edge of the column, vehicles that had pulled off the road and were attempting to disperse into the desert. Both missiles tracked and hit. Then the Mavericks were gone too, and what remained was the gun. This was the phase of the engagement that nobody talked about the same way afterward. With bombs and missiles expended, Wilson's flight dropped down to 2,000 feet and began strafing runs along the length of the column. At that altitude, at 300 knots, the details resolved with nauseating clarity. He could make out individual vehicles, open doors, objects scattered on the road surface that could have been luggage or could have been bodies. 65 rounds per second of depleted uranium hitting a soft-skinned truck turns it into shrapnel that damages the vehicles on either side of it, a cascading effect that multiplied the destruction far beyond what the raw round count would suggest. Wilson's after-action debrief noted that on his third gun pass, he observed secondary explosions from at least 2 vehicles that he had not directly targeted, ammunition or fuel cooking off from fragmentation damage caused by hits on adjacent vehicles, and then the helicopter showed up. 2 Mi-8 HIPs, Soviet-built transport helicopters, big lumbering machines with a top speed of maybe 140 knots, appeared at low altitude northeast of the column, apparently attempting to evacuate senior Iraqi officers from a command post near the Mutla police station. Wilson's wingman, Captain Eric Salamanson, spotted them first. He broke formation without waiting for clearance, rolled into a pursuit curve from the hip's 7 o'clock position, and fired a 3-second burst from approximately 3,000 feet of slant range. The first hip shed its tail rotor assembly and went into an immediate uncontrolled spin, impacting the desert floor at what Salomonsson estimated was a 60-degree nose-down angle. The second hip's pilot saw what happened, flared hard, and attempted to land in open desert west of the road. Salomonsson came around for a second pass and caught it on the ground, rotors still turning, with a 2-second burst that walked across the cockpit and engine nacelle. It burned for 40 minutes. The debrief tape from that afternoon, I've listened to a copy held at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell, captures Wilson's voice, flat with fatigue, stating that his 4-ship flight had expended all ordnance in 27 minutes of continuous engagement. 4 aircraft, 27 minutes. The tally: 4 confirmed tank kills, an estimated 23 vehicles destroyed or damaged by gun and bomb, 2 helicopters destroyed. Salomonsson's helicopter kills brought the A-10 community's air-to-air total in Desert Storm to 6 confirmed rotary wing kills. The debrief tape clicks off with a hiss of static. Nobody in the room says anything. Wilson's 4-ship had done in 27 minutes what an entire Soviet motor rifle regiment was designed to prevent. 6 months later, the country that built those motor rifle regiments ceased to exist. Think about the timing. Desert Storm ended on February 28, 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 26th of that same year. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, conceived in 1966 to kill Soviet armor pouring through the Fulda Gap, built around a gun designed to defeat Soviet tank armor, deployed to bases in West Germany, where pilots practiced flying below Soviet radar coverage through valleys they'd memorized by heart, never once fired a shot at a Soviet target. The Cold War scenario that justified every rivet in the airframe simply evaporated. And yet the airplane had just finished the most lopsided air-to-ground campaign in the history of aerial warfare, destroying over 900 tanks, 2,000 military vehicles, and 1,200 artillery pieces in 43 days. Against Soviet equipment, operated by Soviet-trained crews, using Soviet doctrine, just not against Soviets. The American philosophy that produced the A-10 was the same philosophy that won the Cold War, and it wasn't complicated. Build the thing that works, not the thing that looks fastest on a spec sheet, not the thing that gets a general's name in Aviation Week, the thing that works when someone is shooting back. The Soviets understood this distinction in reverse. Their entire military-industrial apparatus optimized for impressive numbers on paper, while the actual products rusted in motor pools from Vladivostok to East Berlin. The T-72 had beautiful specifications. In the Iraqi desert, T-72s burned like filing cabinets. I keep coming back to that Kubinka assessment from 1984. Approaches unity. The Soviets knew. Their own Armor Research Institute told them, in writing with test data, that the A-10's gun would kill their tanks from the side with mathematical certainty. They knew it 7 years before Desert Storm. They spent real rubles developing countermeasures. The Contact 1 reactive armor, improved side skirt packages, even proposals for active protection systems that wouldn't materialize for another 2 decades. All of it oriented toward defeating a 30mm depleted uranium. Round fired from an airplane their own intelligence services publicly dismissed as too slow to survive. The GRU's flying joke assessment, fed to Warsaw Pact commanders throughout the 1980s, was probably the most consequential lie the Soviet military ever told itself, because the Iraqi officers who inherited Soviet tactical doctrine also inherited Soviet contempt for the A-10. They positioned their air defenses to counter fast-moving fighter bombers at medium altitude. They dispersed their armor expecting attacks from standoff missiles launched at range. They did not adequately prepare for an airplane that would fly low enough to smell the diesel exhaust from their tank engines and slow enough to make a second pass before they could traverse their turrets. an airplane tough enough to absorb their return fire and keep shooting. The word ugly appears in at least 3 separate Soviet assessments of the A-10 that have been declassified or leaked since 1991. Each time in the context of aerodynamic inelegance, paired with dismissive commentary about its speed and survivability. The Soviets looked at the A-10 and saw an airplane that violated every principle of modern combat aircraft design. They were correct. It did violate those principles. Fairchild Republic built it that way on purpose, because the mission didn't need a beautiful airplane. It needed a flying gun with a titanium bathtub around the pilot and enough redundancy to fly home missing an engine, half a wing, and most of its hydraulic system. The USSR spent its final decade building defenses against the weapon that had already rendered its armor doctrine obsolete. Reactive armor, point defense systems, radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, improved camouflage netting. Billions of rubles poured into countering an airplane that cost $18.8 million per unit in 1994 dollars. The empire went bankrupt trying. The airplane is still flying. Somewhere in the spring of 2024, at Moody Air Force Base in southern Georgia, a crew chief with grease on her knuckles and the smell of hydraulic fluid on her flight suit was torquing a panel back onto an A-10C, the same basic airframe that rolled off the Fairchild Republic line in 1977, updated with precision targeting pods and GPS-guided munitions, still carrying the same 7-barrel gun. She finished the job, initialed the maintenance log, and sent it back to the flight line.